The odds that you stumbled upon and discovered the absolute best set of conditions at any one of your spots right out the gate is unfucking possible.
Yes. Amen.
Welcome to another episode of the Surfcast Podcast. We're coming in hot today.
Feeling some very strong feels.
Yes.
Dropping some Fs right at the beginning because we really want to make the point.
And that is as much of a shot at myself, as you will see, as anyone. So do not take personal offense to that. I was reminding myself of this because we don't know it all. We're always learning.
Yeah, so with that said, Toby, what the heck? Where are we going with this? How did you start it that way? Why did you start it that way, I should say? What are we talking about?
Other than shock factor, as we were talking about prepping this, what we're going to talk about here today is essentially a branch of the concept of fully fishing all conditions, scenarios, and everything at any of your spots. And we're going to start with the tide.
That's right. You hear all the time the idea that you should be hammering, pick a couple of spots, hammer them to death, every wind, every tide, every condition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We hear that over and over and over. But what Toby's about to lay out for you, we don't hear quite as much.
So I have my spots that I fish. We all do. And I'm trying at any point in the season, any outing, to maximize them, fully learn them, dig into them, pick them apart, every bit and piece. And when I start to find success, I start to develop what I believe are patterns. And the easiest thing to see right out the gate is the tides. So I very negatively, to a degree, get into hard patterns of spot A is this tide, whether it's direction, coming out, going stage, etc., where I fall into this trap of assuming I have the best set of conditions. And I'm always going to go, okay, the tide is high at this hour. I'm going to go there at this stage of the tide at this rock, and that is the best. Now, I might have found some very good success at that, but to then ignore all other aspects, all other stages of the tide at that spot, not just early on, but for all eternity, you are doing yourself, and I'm doing myself, a huge disservice. And really, if I try to remind myself, if I'm really trying to fully pick these spots apart, I'm not even doing that. If I'm ignoring, 80% of the tide and the current and all of that by not fishing the opposite, the air quote, bad tide.
Yes, the bad tide. You said something very important that I thought we would get to later, but we're already there already. And that's that you said that once you find success, you start to focus down on the pattern and the spot becomes about X factors. And one of those being what tide, whether it's in or out, it's the top, it's the bottom, it's the middle, it's 3 hours, it's 2 hours, it's 10 hours, whatever it is. But when you get success, you start to focus on that. And I think that that's one of the biggest traps. And that's one of the biggest things about this concept that I don't hear get talked about as much. This is mostly pointed at people who are starting out. When you start out, what should I do? Pick a spot that's the closest to you, fish the hell out of it, learn it first, then start to branch out. But the thing is, once you start to have some success, early success, you can get trapped. And that's really where the F-bomb at the beginning of this is coming from, right, Toby? If you start to have moderate levels of success, don't be too quick to say, aha, I've got it.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if that success continues to sort of be flat and it's mostly smaller fish, because you may not be on it, correct?
Oh, certainly. And one of the pitfalls there is, especially if you're, I guess it's both sides. It's if you're just learning a spot or if you've become, let's just say, familiar with a spot, that if you've got that level of success, regardless of how good or bad it might be, to then consider, I'm going to remove that tide factor and I'm essentially going to try to do poorly, because that's really what you're trying to do. I mean, granted, you're trying to find success, but you're trying to do poorly and eliminate those bad stretches of tide. You're trying to knock those out of the equation. And, by try to find bad, meaning if you've got, let's say, a 2-hour window that you today say, this is the best window of this spot. You're then assuming that all the others are bad. So you want to prove that to make yourself feel better that I am on the right piece. But the likelihood of that, again, is just so slim. And I've countless times over the years have been shown this and have discovered this. And one of the ways that at one of my spots, without giving away anything, this could be anyone at any place, it took me a little while to realize that I knew another guy who fished this area. And he fished it a lot, and I fished this spot a lot. I never saw him until we started crossing paths at the beginnings and ends of our outings. So I would fish through to, my stretch of the tide that I liked, and I was leaving as he was coming in. We'd wave, we knew who we were, we never had a conversation, we knew who each other was, we gave each other our space. And it happened on the other side where he'd be leaving as I was coming in. And I then didn't want, obviously, to go and, steal his spot on him and show up at the same time. But eventually, once there was openings and he wasn't fishing it as often, I started fishing a flip side and those tides that he was, and was able to find out so much more about the entire body of life that occurs at this spot. And it was one that I'm thinking of that. I sort of took that concept and applied it out from there to a lot of my places. And I've found at some of them much better stages of the tide under certain conditions. I've found some that, there is one spot that, I did find the best spot right off the bat. To this day, I still have yet to do any better at other stages. So, I got lucky there. But of all the places I've fished, that's such the odds just aren't there. And we don't always, we're always sort of thinking we know it best. So many of us want to be confident in what we're doing. We're not going to go out there if we're not confident. So you kind of have to think that there is going to be success. I am maximizing the potential here. I have the best shot of catching. So you don't want to put yourself in those negative spots. You don't want to handicap yourself, but you really, really need to, if you want, again, to really fully understand and take full potential of any location you're fishing.
That's right. And I will tell you that I was yelling earlier, I realized on the recording. I'm probably kind of loud because I get so fired up about this. But one of my best spots, probably my best spot, it doesn't necessarily produce always the biggest fish, but it's been very consistent for me for years now. I started fishing completely the wrong tide. I started on the wrong tide, and I had fish immediately. I had fish right away, and they were all schoolies. And
quick question: the wrong tide by what level are you making that assumption?
So I have now fished this spot around the clock in every possible condition you can imagine, and I have found that during most of the year, the fish come on a specific set of tides, and actually in a specific part of the tide, but even that is wrong, and maybe I'll get to that example after I get to this, but because that has changed even more recently. But I went there with a theory based on good striper theory, like stripers are going to be here at this particular tide stage because the water temperature, the water depth, the bait that's probably going to be prevalent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Came up with a theory, went and executed it. I say right away, I actually didn't have fish for a couple of outings, a couple of nights. But that first month, I got into fish pretty much right away. And that is not always true. That's not always true. Yes, people listening, even us who fish this hard and have this skill and this level of success, a month, 2 months, 3 months is not necessarily long enough to tell you anything. You might need more than a season. So I just want to make that point too. So anyways, I went and I had success, but I was like, you know what? I feel like there's more potential here. It speaks to me more. These schoolies are not really telling me anything. So, okay, let me take the data I have and let me stretch it into the next tide. So now fish through the portion of the tide that I want, and then was like, well, the top of the tide I don't think is going to be great. The bottom of the tide I don't think is going to be great, that transition. But I'm going to hang out and try to force myself to stay mentally engaged. And then I'm going to try and fish the other side of it. And as soon as I did that, boom, the very first fish I landed was 18 pounds, which is not very big, but it was a lot bigger than anything else I had landed. And it was like immediate. The change in the size of the fish and my production level was almost instantaneous. So then I started fishing the rest of that tide. So now I'm trying to fish 2 whole tides, and I'm trying to pick, when I can, when makes the most sense, in addition to rotating it into the spots that I was already fishing. But I think that last little tip I just gave you is that if you think you've got it ironed out and you think you have a spot that's all figured out, fishing through the bottom or the top or an additional hour either side of the window that you're focusing on is a very easy way to begin chipping away at that. So Toby, I just got my hands on Hogi's new charter grade needlefish. One of the plugs they launched last season as part of their new Hook One platform. This thing is extremely well built. It swims great, and it's specifically built around a single belly hook and a tail flag, which I know you and I both strongly prefer. I'll tell you, I've heard nothing but good things from other anglers throughout the entire Striper Coast.
That's right. I've been hearing a lot of good things about their needlefish as well. I know it's got heavy-duty stainless steel through wire, so it's tuna-proof, and it comes with VMC hooks, premium split rings, and matching hand-tied bucktail flags. So essentially, it's got the works, all the things that you'd expect from Hogi.
Definitely. Plus, the recent study from the state of Massachusetts showed you can reduce release mortality by as much as 7% by ditching that rear hook, as you and I have talked about already on the podcast. So this is a lure that's helping the fish. Without reducing your catch rate, you're doing your part to reduce release mortality.
And that's one of Hogi's goals. They don't just build fishy gear. They think long-term about the fishery. It's all part of their updated motto that they now live by. Quality for today, conservation for tomorrow. So find out more about the mission and, of course, this awesome new needlefish at hogilures.com. As we've talked about on past episodes of the podcast, the plastic swimmer is one of the most popular plugs that's found in just about every surfcaster's bag, and there are a ton of models to choose from. With its unique body shape and lip design producing a great darting and swimming action, the standout is the Swarter by Joe Bag's Tackle.
That's right, Toby. This plug is fully through wired and it's available in two sizes, the 6-inch 1-ounce model and the 7-inch 1.5-ounce model. It comes in a wide variety of traditional and modern fish-catching colors like bone, blurple, sand eel, and many more. The Swarter excels in a huge variety of surf fishing conditions, from back bays to inlets, and of course, the wide open surf. It's been proven to be a great plug on both the East and West Coast for a variety of species, but particularly the striped bass.
So head on over to joebagsoutdoors.com and grab some Swarters while you support a locally owned business. And while you're there, be sure to check out the annual limited edition colorway, as well as Joe's Swarter kits, specifically tailored to meet a variety of surf fishing scenarios. So that's certainly it's an interesting concept, how you start adding it in to your rotation, and I kind of do some of that as well. But when I start working on a location, any given spot, to try to add in the wrong tide and try to figure out the wrong tide may end up being the right tide, it takes for me a little bit of pre-planning. I don't just, hey, tonight I'm going to go do it, unless on the fly I'm thinking it through. Because what I have found is that on the vast majority of my spots, I'm going to continue to refer to it as the wrong tide. It's not really, but the opposite of what I accepted to be the best would be a different location within that spot. So if I like, this big rock over here is where I always fish on the flood. Well, if I try to fish there on the ebb, it doesn't work the same. The current is set up. The fish stayed differently. You can't present the same. So my first step in fishing the wrong tide at any spot is to reevaluate and try to rethink where the feeding lanes are going to be, where the staging locations, where bait is going to get funneled through, and quite often it ends up being a completely different spot within the spot. So yeah, maybe that first rock that I love on this, on the dropping tide, that it may be the best spot to fish there in that condition. That's what I'm trying to find. But it doesn't mean that level is better or worse than the incoming 100 yards over on a different rock, because again, I have to figure out how to present to different spots. Because I've got some of these spots, a tide rip sets up that just rages in one direction on the flood, and then on the ebb it's not even there, it's a pancake. So the fish are obviously going to react differently, the bait is going to react differently. It's essentially a completely different spot, even though geographically and physically it is the same spot. It's almost like mentally I have to approach it completely differently. My tactics, what I'm using, it might be on a flood, a chunking spot, but it's a soft plastic spot on the incoming. It changes so much. So right off the bat, I try to evaluate it ahead of time so that I have a bit of a game plan coming in to start working off of, as if I am going to a brand new spot I never fished before, because essentially that's what it is for me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And in terms of pre-planning and sort of coming up with a plan of what you're going to do instead of just showing up and being like, well, just tonight, willy-nilly, I'm going to stay an extra hour. I think giving up some of the best parts of the season to do this is really important. So when you know there are fish around, or when you hope there's going to be fish around, which is what it sometimes feels more like, when you hope fish are going to be around, that's when you should be doing this. You should not necessarily be trying to figure out the wrong tide when the spot's not good and the area isn't good in general. So what I do and what I've done in the past is that if I get a good moon, I know that, in Maine, Maine, I don't know why I just said Maine, I meant to say May. In May, when the new moon happens at this particular spot, it's good, let's say. I'll be like, all right, well then this year I'm going to try and do this. I'm going to stay for an extra hour. I'm going to get there an hour earlier. I'm going to fish it, leave, come back. I'm going to go fish another spot that's nearby, something like that. But even easier than that, because this is one of the easiest ways for me I've found, is that if you're into good fish, it's easy to extend because you're psyched, right? You're in it and you want to know, and like that's when you start extending it. And if you had fish last night, let's say you can't do that and maybe it doesn't work out, but that next night show up early, right? So you had fish, you stay late. Now that didn't work. Okay, fine. But tomorrow night show up early. And that's, now you're sort of hitting both sides. That's very different than, what you're talking about, where you're saying, okay, I'm not going to fish the same rock. I'm going to switch to a different look, a different stretch on the shoreline here and fish the opposite, show up completely in the opposite. But it's an easy way to start chipping away. And I think chipping away is probably the smarter way to do this. I think personally that chipping away from it is better, because also we have to keep in mind you've got your best, what you think is best right now, and you're producing fish, and that's great. You've got other spots, and you maybe don't want to be spending all of your time at just this one spot, but you've got another spot. Maybe you've got 2 more spots, and for a lot of you, many more than that starts to get too complicated if you're not fishing at least 5 days a week. So I think it's easy to chip away. It doesn't necessarily lead to the biggest aha moments, is what you're talking about, Toby, where you just show up in the opposite completely and try to think of it completely as a new spot. But I think that's an interesting way to try and do it.
Oh yeah, it depends. If you're like I think that also a piece that, as you're describing it, kind of weighs in on how you and I fish. Meaning, you do more longer sessions on average than I do. Whereas I get out and I have the little windows that I hit, so I try to find some of those windows, or whether purposely or accidentally. Like this past season, I had one of my spots. I wanted to start fishing wrong tides. It's like I got to figure this out outside of my sequence that has worked for. I became way too complacent here. This would admit this to my death, that I was too comfortable that it was ABC, ABC, ABC. And I had been doing that at this place for many years. And this past spring, I don't know, I might have talked about it on the podcast. I know I told you about it in conversation. I screwed up and forgot how to read a tide chart one night. And I thought that I was arriving at 2 hours into the incoming, which is when I go to the spot. And I get there, and I'm like, something ain't right here. This tide, the water level, the current, things are wrong. And I take a couple, and I got a fish. All right, this is cool. Maybe something's just weird, and I got a couple of fish, and I moved around, I got a few more, and then I'm looking at my watch. I have the tidal graph on my watch, and I'm like, oh, yeah, that's right. Up is down is up. I am at, instead of 2 hours in the incoming, I was 2 hours into the outgoing. And I mean, it was completely by accident, but I started fishing that spot now that last year on the wrong tides. Now, granted, I kind of got lucky that first time I found some fish, because it didn't happen that way, obviously, every time. Every spot isn't great on every single outing, as we know. I got a little lucky that I found some, so it gave me a little confidence to continue to try it. But what I was getting at, though, is I think a piece of it, your approach first, what I had mentioned, and it could work differently for each individual out there.
That's right.
If you're willing and able to do If you're planning a 4-hour outing, a 5-hour outing, and you can add 2 hours onto it with no repercussions, meaning you can get sufficient rest, whatever the case may be. Absolutely. For me, it just works out where it's easier for me to just take little windows, consecutive nights, work those little windows and see what happens. And it also weighs into how I approach that. If it's not working there on that little window, for better or worse, I'm going in with a plan B. So that if I go in and I'm trying an opposite tide and for whatever reason, things just aren't happening. Whether I realize quickly that maybe the weather conditions aren't going to be conducive for the spot at this stage of the tide, or it just doesn't feel. You get that feeling that something's just not here. I still have a backup confidence spot in mind, so that I don't totally destroy. Now the drawback is. And I know for myself, I can oftentimes be really quick to then bail on bad to go to potentially
and
good.
Go to the spot that's plan B, but actually is kind of plan A.
Yeah, you got to have that willpower, and I don't have that all the time, which is, partly why it takes longer for me to add some of these wrong tide spots in. But again, in the end, you learn, you become a better angler, because you're adding more to your entire knowledge base of fishing, whether it's that spot or how you can apply it to other locations and how you can rethink other spots. I've had occurrences where this location might change and develop in this manner. And all right, it didn't actually benefit anything. I didn't find any better success at, spot A. But spot Z, maybe it'll work over there. And this is sort of like that. And I've had that occur where a wrong condition tide scenario at one spot didn't work, but it was able to transfer to a degree and make me rethink and apply it on a different spot to then continue to further work out the grand scope of all of the knowledge that I'm working on day to day.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Toby. Before I forget, I want to add in something that I think gets to what you're talking about, but it certainly gets to what we've been talking about overall. I have a couple of spots, but one I'm thinking about in particular. There was a certain stage in the tide that I really focused on. And there was a subsection of the tide that was kind of secondary, and it depended on how much energy I had. This kind of gets to what you're talking about. Had depending on how much energy I had, how good the fishing had been. If there was a lot of fish around and the fishing was good, I would fish this whole section. It essentially ended up being almost an entire tide. And then I started focusing down at one specific section of the tide, towards the end of the tide. And I did that for years. And over the years, it sort of started to not work out. And I was like, what is going on? Is the spot not good anymore? Is the pattern not good anymore? But what ended up happening is I went back to that other portion of the tide that I had been neglecting, that I hadn't been fishing as much, because I started burrowing my head down in the sand and focusing so much on this and putting the blinders on, because that's where I was getting my 40s. Well, as soon as I went back and started fishing that other section, all of a sudden I was getting 20s and 30s again, and I hadn't been getting anything. And I don't want to get into the details of the spot, not even so much because I want to protect it, but it gets way too complicated. But the point is, if you think you got it nailed down to 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 45 minutes, that's probably where you're starting to make a bit of a mistake. And I'm all for the slack tide window. I'm all for the tide against current. I've talked about this a lot. Maybe not so much on the podcast, but it's something I've talked about in seminars and stuff. I'm totally with Alberto and his, he's the one that gets a lot of credit about the slack windows and the magic windows and all that stuff. But I think that if you've gotten stuck on that with the way the fishery has been and it hasn't been working out so much recently, going back and saying like, wait a second, this whole tide might, forget about fishing the opposite tide. Maybe I need to reevaluate the whole tide. Just the same tide, the same current direction. Let's say, for example, although that may not be true for you, maybe a depth thing, the way it interacts with the rocks or the sand or whatever. But going back and saying, I haven't fished that other window I used to for a season, for 10 years, whatever it is. And going back and really saying, okay, I know now I need to maximize every piece of data that I have with the fishery the way it is. I'm going to go back to the drawing board a little bit and find out if I've been missing something after all these years. This has been a weekly edition of the Surfcast Podcast. You can find out more about the podcast at surfcastpodcast.com, or definitely check us out on social media, Facebook, Instagram, at the Surfcast Podcast.